Hey, welcome to another episode of the Nicholas Pereira Show. I am super excited to be chatting today with Rod Cumberland. I'm going to dive right into it. The Crooked CBC, you know we love them here. Here's what they have to say. So I'll give you a little intro to Rod, just in case you're unfamiliar with him. Here's what they have to say. Former instructor Rod Cumberland is suing the Maritime College of Forest Technology for wrongful dismissal, claiming his views on the use of the herbicide glyphosate led to his firing. If you're unfamiliar with glyphosate and the spraying and this herbicide that's being used in New Brunswick, you're going to be familiar shortly. Rod, welcome to the show. How's it going tonight?
Thanks a lot, Nick. Thanks for having me, and things are going great.
Good. Yeah, and I see a bunch of people are here tuning in live. Thank you so much. So if you're tuning in live, make sure you guys, hit the like button, share it out, all that kind of stuff. If you're watching the recording, make sure that you subscribe and you're tuned into all of the different channels. We know, hey, Elon Musk, go Elon. He today we're celebrating the day of recording this. Elon has officially bought Twitter, and we've seen all of these people flood back to Twitter going free speech. Maybe one day Facebook will do the same thing. We'll see. But it is known that we are being suppressed in many different ways. I know my reach has gone down, but we're doing everything we can. So it's important that you subscribe, you hit the notification bell, because you will get notified of when I'm going live. You will get notified of posts and content if you are specifically following, getting notified. So I invite you to do that right now.
Become a member of the Canadian Unity Project by visiting the links in the description.
Let's dive into this. If you're not familiar with Rod Cumberland, he's got kind of an incredible story, sad story, exciting story, all at the same time. I'm excited. I happen to be an optimistic, positive guy, and I think there's a huge opportunity to help Rod in his fight. Rod, why don't we dive right into it? Give us a little background about who you are and ultimately what's going on in your world and how it relates to all of us living here in New Brunswick.
Okay, awesome. Thanks again, Nick. I guess my journey kind of started back when I was a young fella. My dad was a big hunter in New Brunswick. I used to fill the freezer every fall, and I used to traipse after him as a 5-year-old kid. And I just was enamored with whitetail deer. And my dream job was to be a deer biologist someday. I wanted to work with deer. Somebody said to me back in my teen years, if you could do anything for your entire life, what would you pick something that you'd love to do? And I said, I want to wake up every morning and play with deer. Like, that would be so phenomenal. And, awesome. I went to the University of New Brunswick. They had a good wildlife program there. I actually have a bachelor's degree in forestry from UNB. And then my minor was in wildlife management. So I kind of got a two-edged sword, which was kind of nice. I could work in forestry or wildlife. Obviously, my heart was in wildlife. So I started working at the Department of Natural Resources. I was a fur bearer biologist for the first 7 years, and then I spent the next 15 years at my dream job when I was 32 years old, being the provincial deer biologist, and absolutely loved it. I loved every minute I did it. I loved giving presentations. We captured white-tailed deer fawns, 53 of them over 2006, 2007, and followed them around to find out what was causing their mortality. So, I had an awesome career, while I was there at DNR, and had no intention of ever being where I'm at. Like, there was no plan whatsoever. I was managing deer, and I got a phone call. We were trying to grow the deer herd as fast as we could to basically get up to the numbers we had in the 1980s, which was around a harvest of 30,000, a population of around 210,000. So I dropped the deer permits. I fought with a lot of people to do that, but I looked at the numbers. I knew what we needed to do to make hay in the province with deer. So we did that. I made some predictions, some bold predictions. Our age-sex ratio would change a certain way. Our herd would grow at a certain pace. And actually all those things happened. But what happened was, where the deer herd grew was not where we expected it. In the 60s and 80s, when we had all kinds of deer in the province, they were out on crown land in cuts, what we called choppings. That's where people used to hunt. Okay. Harvested area where all kinds of young hardwood were growing. And basically, hardwood is produced at exponential rates on those areas, which will support exponential growth in a deer herd, because that's how a deer herd grows.
Okay.
So when all of a sudden we tried to grow the deer herd, and there was very few deer. We actually had vacant deer yards all across the province on Crown land. And then I was getting nuisance calls. So at the time we were trying to grow the herd, it only grew to about a third of what it was in the 80s. So we harvested 10,000 deer in 2007 and 8. And that's only a third of what we did in the 80s, which was 30,000. And the herd was still under 100,000 deer. So I didn't see the growth I was expecting. And then the other thing was, it wasn't in the areas I was hoping it would be in. So at that time, Irving they wanted wood. They were harvesting what they called sustainably. But even though they were harvesting sustainably, they said they were running out of wood. Well, that's kind of, they don't go in the same sentence.
A little bit of an oxymoron, right? If it's sustainable, you shouldn't be running out.
Exactly. But and again, we had vacant deer yards, and they wanted the deer yards. So people throughout my career said, pick the hill you die on. Well, that was a hill I chose to die on. And I said, no, we're not giving up the deer yards. We saved them for this time when there was a low in the wood supply. And but my question back to the guys that I was working with was, why are our deer yards vacant? We've saved all this supposed to be perfect habitat for deer, and yet deer aren't in these areas. So why is that? And no one had an answer. So I started digging into it on my own. And it didn't take long to find out that these areas where we had very few deer, one of them was down where I grew up in St. Stephen, the Charlotte County area. There was no deer along the Macadavy River, and there was hunters down there that called me down to check the area out. I got some maps from our habitat guys. They said there's all kinds of regenerating stands here. Look at them all. There should be all kinds of food. However, rather than taking them at the word, I actually went out and measured and looked at what was growing there. And almost 70% of the area was sprayed. And it was coming back in spruce plantations, which we all know doesn't hold a whole lot of deer food. So it became very obvious to me what was going on, why there wasn't any deer there. There wasn't any food there.
So why? Okay, so there's spraying happening in these. Okay, so a couple of things I want to touch upon. So first of all, you said, I want to go back to, you said you were getting nuisance calls. Can you just give us a quick, just definition of what that means?
Okay. Sure. Yeah. And excuse me for going 100 mile an hour and assuming.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to interject and be like, hold on. Yeah. So nuisance calls,
a nuisance call is somebody, that's someone calling to say, I've got deer in my backyard. They're mowing down my hostas. They're causing me all kinds of problems. They're being a pain in my butt. They're a nuisance. Or, the town of Rossay calling saying, hey, there's, we have too many roadkills. There's all, we've got Lyme disease. It's just deer are causing a nuisance where they're at. Agricultural areas. Yeah.
And I was going to say, like, that's like anybody living in Quispam-Sis, Milledgeville, Manawaganish Road, Ross,
Darlings Island, St. George. Oh yeah, there's a ton of them.
Everybody there knows, that there's deer everywhere. My family, who moved from Toronto, now live in Quispam-Sis. They're like, there's so much deer here. Now, of course, they're from Toronto, so they think it's amazing, right? Because they're like, oh my, because you don't get that in the middle of Toronto. But at the same time, I know a lot of folks living here for a while. It has become a nuisance. And, and I'll just share my ignorance. And this is one of the reasons I want to have you on, because I know a lot of people probably are like me, very quite ignorant to what's going on and maybe just learning about it now. I was thinking, well, that's just because we human beings are living in their area. And that's just the way it is. But after doing some more research and speaking to you, I've learned that that's not the case. So, okay, I just wanted to define what a nuisance call is, because it's very relatable for everybody here in New Brunswick. The second thing I want to ask you is, you discovered that there was spraying. There was, I believe you said 70% less food for the deer. So what is the purpose? First of all, who's spraying and why are they spraying?
Okay. Great questions. So what the goal of the forest industry is to grow softwood trees to supply the mills. So they want it for lumber, they want it for pulp and paper. And so they make plantations, they plant little green trees. They found that if they plant trees, they get a lot, what we call full stocking. So rather than having a tree here and there, they have trees full, spaced out every 6 to 8 feet. And the whole area is occupied. So you're growing a lot of wood on that area. Now, what we do know, there's something called tree silvics, and that's basically the properties of a tree. Different trees have different properties. For example, a birch tree is what we would call an early successional species, or what we call shade intolerant. So they're not tolerant of the shade, which means they can't grow well in shaded conditions. So what they do, their strategy for growth is to occupy an area quickly, grow as fast as they can, and take over the sunlight and the nutrients on the site. Because if they don't have that, if they don't have the sunlight, they're going to die. Then we have shade intolerant species, and that's the spruces and firs and trees like that.
Okay.
And they can grow in the shade. So if you have a big canopy of hardwoods, the softwood trees are still there. They're going to grow very slowly, but underneath them, because they can handle very little sunlight. So both of those strategies determine what grows on a piece of ground. So if you clear cut an area, the first thing that happens is all the big hardwood stumps have all this nutrient in the roots, and they're going to make these what we call stump sprouts. Okay, and hardwoods do that, whereas softwoods don't. So hardwoods will occupy the site very quickly. They've got all kinds of nutrients, a full root mat already there, and they grow very quickly. But that's how they grow. They're shade intolerant. So what happens is when you plant these areas, the hardwoods take over, and of course it slows the growth of the softwoods. Well, that's not what the forest industry wants. In order for them to cut as fast as they want, then they need to get rid of the hardwoods so that the softwoods take over and grow as fast as they can. So in order to do that, you need to get rid of the hardwood trees. And for years, I used to use motor manual systems, which was basically a guy in the ground with a brush saw cutting these trees down, and then the softwoods would be what we call released. There's no hardwoods there now, so the softwoods can jump up and take advantage of the light. But they found out through research, through actually the federal government paid for a lot of this research, and found that there is a product, a herbicide, which kills hardwood trees really, really well, and that's called glyphosate. And it's a lot more cost effective to spray it, and it kills the hardwood trees, and it actually kills them very well. It's one of the best herbicides. We have other herbicides that they've tested that don't work that well, but glyphosate works incredibly well. That's why we use it, and it kills all the hardwoods on a site. If the hardwoods bounce back at any point in time in the next 2 or 3 years, they'll spray it again, because the goal is, in order to keep cutting as fast as they are, they have to have these softwood plantations fully occupied and growing with no hardwood competition. So that's the goal, and that's why they use glyphosate to do it.
So glyphosate is being used. So I just want to recap, make sure I understand. Glyphosate is being used to kill hardwood trees.
Yep.
And the reason that that they're doing this is so that they can grow softwood trees, because softwood trees are better for industry, essentially.
That's correct.
Now, why is hardwood trees something, sorry, excuse me, that you said, and I'm just trying to get all the information in my head. Something that you said is there's about 70% less food. So my guess, and what I'd like to hear from you is it's not just glyphosate isn't just targeting hardwood trees. Then, if I can understand that right, it's basically killing all kinds of vegetation, including food for the deer and the animals out there. Is that correct? Or can you bring clarity around that?
You're right on the money. It's called a broad spectrum herbicide, which means that it'll kill a lot of different herbaceous and plant species, but basically it's broadleaf plants. So the reason that matters is white-tailed deer are a browser. So they browse on hardwood twigs. Now they will browse on grasses and forbs, and they'll eat raspberry leaves, lots of different things like that. But hardwood leaves, and then in the wintertime specifically, hardwood twigs is what gets them through, and also cedar fronds as well. But that's what they need in New Brunswick. That's what's grown their population so big in New Brunswick. And then we've removed that. So what I had to do, because people said, oh, well, we only spray 1% of the land base. And you hear that all the time from the forestry people. We spray so little, it doesn't matter. So I said, okay, you're not getting it. Number one, you're not understanding how it grows exponentially. And how that works is if you have a one shoot of maple. Okay, so I have a maple shoot growing in this plant, in this clear cut, and then the deer eats the bud. Okay, so it eats the top of that bud. So what happens the next year is that terminal bud's gone, but the lateral buds, there's 2 or 3 or 4 buds down below this called laterals. And what happens is they now sprout and grow. So the next year, rather than having 1, you now have 4. So of course, now you've actually multiplied the amount of browse on that ground. So the deer being there browsing actually causes a lot of this exponential growth. So what I did is I said, okay, well, I got to put this in terms that they understand. Even though there's a lot of research that shows our deer herds in the eastern Canada and the U.S. grew because of our small clear cuts, small openings that we were making in the forest. That was what was causing all this profuse growth. So I said, okay, well, let's look at this. So If we look at how much food a deer eats a year, a deer can eat a ton of food a year. So then if we look at what a typical harvested area, a clear cut produces, it can grow actually a ton of deer food per acre. So then we look at how much ground is sprayed. We know we spray every year in New Brunswick. We spray annually 15,000 hectares, and that's being conservative.
Okay.
So that's over 32,000 acres. So every year we spray, we remove 32,000 tons of deer food. And I've said all along, as a deer biologist, if you remove 32,000 tons of deer food on the landscape every single year, that has an impact on the deer in that area. And no one can argue that. They try to say, no, that's, his research is crazy. His numbers don't. Bull. If you look at the numbers, 32,000 tons of deer food will feed 32,000 deer. And we remove that every single year from Crown land. It has to have an impact.
So because we're removing, basically we're killing our forests, the deer population is decreasing then in the natural environments that they would be flourishing. And then my understanding is that that's why we're seeing an increase of them in our neighborhoods, which is a danger for us, specifically, or a nuisance for a lot of people. And that's because the environment essentially is better for them within the urban cities, or the urban places. Is that
right?
Correct? Or why are they showing up? And bring a little bit more detail to that if you can, of why are they showing up in the middle of Rossay Avenue and on Manawaganish Road and down at St. Stephen and St. George? Why are they there and eating our lawns as opposed to being in the forest, which would make way more sense in any logical way to think about it, that they would be out there where they're a lot in their natural environments.
Right. And that's a really good question. And a lot of people think because we're spraying in the forest, the deer look around and go, oh, this isn't good. Pack your bags, kids. We're moving to the city.
Right.
And that's actually not what happens in the deer world. So one of my strengths when I was a deer biologist was demography, was looking at all the inputs into a population, your mortality rates, your fecundity rates, and why do the herds grow at the rates they do. So to understand that, basically what's happening is at one time, we had all kinds of food on Crown land, and we didn't have a lot of predators. Actually, back in the 60s, we didn't have any coyotes. So basically, all there was bobcats in the wintertime for deer to worry about. So there wasn't a lot of predation in the winter, and there was hunting just for during the season, but there was a lot of food. So basically, there was a lot more natality. There was a lot more growth there because there wasn't a lot of mortality. But what happened over time, coyotes came into the picture. So all of a sudden now we have a predator. And even though coyotes aren't overly successful chasing and killing deer, they chase them. And that plays into the deer ecology in that they put on about 30% more body fat in the fall of the year. And then they live off that body fat throughout the winter because the food they're feeding on, which is hardwood browse, isn't really high in nutritional value. So basically what's happened is the coyotes have kind of changed that equation a little bit because the deer are running a lot more. They're using up more energy. So what's happened over the last 20 years is basically there's less food on Crown land because we're spraying a lot of it. And of course, there's predation out there, although there's predation in both places. I mean, people have seen coyotes in their backyard. So I mean, that's but the biggest change that we have is there's less mortality in and around urban areas because you can't get in there and hunt, right? So unless you have a bow and you have a special permit or something. So there's less mortality in the towns. So in towns, there's less mortality and there's good food. And in the woods, there's more mortality and less food. So over time, those two populations change like this. And that's what we've watched. So it's not a matter of the deer actually physically moving. It's just there's more mortality out in the woods. There's less mortality in urban areas, and that you've seen that change. And that's why most people think we don't have a deer problem in Brunswick. There's deer everywhere. Well, there's deer on your street corner, but if you go out in the woods where they used to be out in the these cut areas, you'll see that there's hardly any deer out in the backwoods of New Brunswick. So that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, so that it's really interesting because yes, I would have been like, there's no way there's a deer problem in New Brunswick, right? Like we see them all the time, but obviously there is. Now I'm gonna play selfish human for a second here, and I'm gonna be like, you know what? I don't give a shit about the deer. Okay, that's not true, but I'm going to just play that for the sake of this conversation. I think that we should all be environmentally sound and live as harmoniously as we can with nature. But let me be a selfish human here for a second and say, why, as a human being, do I care? Why not just, get rid of the deer, get them out of my backyard? They're eating my flowers, blah, 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 blah. Why should I care? I know that they're a nuisance. Why else should I care that our province is essentially being sprayed with this chemical? How does that affect me, my body, my health, and my children's health?
Okay, well, other than in my humble opinion, deer are one of the most beautiful animals on the planet.
Yeah, we know that. We know you love the deer, but
So-
that's what I'm saying.
so-
I'm gonna be the asshole human that's like, forget your deer, right?
Okay.
But why
So
should
I'll
I
put aside
care
my
about me?
bias.
Yeah.
Put aside my bias. The other issue, I mean, even if deer wasn't, let's say hypothetically, for your point, that it doesn't bother deer and deer are fine without glyphosate spraying, why not just let them spray it? Well, that's a
Right.
really good question, because actually there's been a ton of research done. And as I get into this, my problem is, as a biologist and as a researcher, over the years, I've always had to, whenever I wrote a paper or had to come up with a new study design or something, I had to go back and actually look at all the research that existed. What does it say? Look at the methods, look at the results, look at the conclusions, and try to figure out what applies in New Brunswick and what doesn't. And in my process of doing that, of course, when I started looking into the whole thing about deer and glyphosate and habitat, I get into all this research on habitat and the glyphosate spraying. And I realized very quickly that there's been a ton of research done on this, but the results are quite surprising. And
Okay.
one thing the thing that showed up off the bat was that the forestry research all showed glyphosate is phenomenal. It kills hardwoods phenomenal. It works really well. We need to use it. And then I looked over at the wildlife research and it all said glyphosate doesn't hurt wildlife. And I thought, are you nuts? So anyways, without going down that rabbit hole a long ways, when I really got into it and looked at those papers, the guys that were summarizing that research were summarizing stuff from all over the world, and they were including all kinds of weak herbicides. So they always used the word herbicide in general to say it was positive for wildlife when they were using 2,4-D, 2,4,5-C, tricloper, and all these weak herbicides, and they were lumping them all together. And Lautenschlager and Sullivan, there was a bunch of researchers that did this, and I noticed that very quickly in their research, and I thought, you guys are not painting a good picture. The other thing they did is they included roe deer from France, black-tailed deer from BC, and none of that stuff was really applicable to the province. Then the other thing I noticed is when I started looking at glyphosate, then all of a sudden there was two branches of research there. There was a lot of industry-based research on glyphosate that showed glyphosate is safe to drink. You can drink it like water. And then you had all this independent research that showed that no, glyphosate is actually what we say it is. It's carcinogenic. It causes all kinds of damage to reproductive cells. It causes non-Hodgkin lymphoma. It has all kinds of problems. And the neat thing, not the neat thing, but the most obvious thing is the industry research was only 30 days long, very specific, and it just looked at acute toxicity, which is, you take something and it has an effect right off the bat. If you looked at all the private research that was done, they actually, and one guy specifically, and the reason that I'm just another notch in the totem pole. Right. A guy before me, Eric Cirolini, was a researcher in France. He did research for Monsanto because they wanted to use glyphosate over in Europe. And he did the same thing that they always do.
Monsanto is banned, I know, in like Italy and many different countries over in Europe for using this chemical, but it's still used in America and here, obviously, right at home.
Yeah, and this is why. So Eric Cirolini did the research over there that like the industry always does, 30-day trials, looked at acute toxicity, and he didn't find a lot of mortality in his rats over the short term. However, he kept his rats alive after the study was over. He kept them alive for a year. He kept them alive as long as they stayed alive because they all started dying from cancerous growths all over their body. And he published a paper a year after that saying, look at this. I kept these rats alive and look at the problems that I'm having with these rats that were sprayed with glyphosate. And he published that. And then Monsanto had an all-out attack on Eric Cirolini They got one of their previous employees on the board of the journal that was published in. They got the paper redacted. So, I mean,
Wow.
they get very involved. If there's a scientist that speaks something other than what they want to hear, is that glyphosate's great, they make a very concerted effort to attack that person and get that person out of the public limelight.
So we know that yourself, along with other scientists around the world, and again, glyphosate has now been banned in different countries in Europe. So they were able to win that fight, which gives us a lot of hope here that we can win that fight. But we know it becomes political, and for people, most people that are tuned in know that I'm the candidate for the People's Party of Canada in St. John Ross, an overall advocate for healthy living. And one of the things that we stand for is prioritizing practical solution to protecting our air, water, and soil. And, that's why I'm interested in this. Personally, I don't feel that this is a partisan issue. I don't care whether you vote NDP or Liberal. When it comes to our environment, it affects us all. And we are what we eat, and we are our environment. It's a very basic principle. It seems like somewhere in our consciousness, we separate ourselves from the environment. Like, oh, there's an environmental issue over there that has nothing to do with me. And it's like getting back to that idea of, wait a sec, you are the environment and the environment is you. We cannot separate ourselves from that. And that's why I've decided to learn more about this and see how I can lend a helping hand and what can I do to stop this. Because I'm very concerned with the health of our people right now. I look around our province, I see that we're very unhealthy. We have tremendously high cancer rates. We have obesity rates that are through the roof. There's so many health issues. And now I'm learning that ultimately big industry is spraying this. And then connecting and learning a little bit more about you, I've also learned that the same corruption that we're seeing in different parts, you kind of watch these documentaries and you think, yeah, that happens out there in Europe, right? The corruption is out there. That's a European problem. That's an American problem, right? These things. But then we find out that it's happening here. So I'm going to go back to that question: who is spraying this? And is it the Irving Corporation? Is this what we're looking at? Are the Irvings the main sprayers, or are there other players here?
Right. So I would, as far as corruption goes, I'd put these players in New Brunswick up against the best in the world as far as corruption, because they wrote the book on it.
Wow.
Who's spraying it here in the province? And again, my whole focus has been on white-tailed deer and the impact that glyphosate has to deer habitat. That's always been my concern. However, glyphosate, when you start looking into glyphosate, you realize it's not just sprayed on the forest. Now, it is. If the chief medical health officer did a report back, and actually the first one, Elise Cleary, was fired for looking into glyphosate spraying. And then the new one, Russell, when she came on, she actually finished up the report on glyphosate and used Len Ritter. He was actually hired by, and Len Ritter is the guy that defended Agent Orange on Base Gagetown years ago. So our government, in their wisdom, hired Len Ritter to help them with glyphosate spraying. So you know how that's going to end up. And basically, they said that the report said nothing about whether we should or should not use glyphosate, but it did say that as far as all the provinces in Canada goes, we are one of the most heavily sprayed provinces in our forests when it comes to glyphosate. Now, glyphosate is used mostly, and this is where it really applies to the average person out there that doesn't think this is an issue with them, because I'm talking about deer in the woods. Glyphosate is used in the agricultural industry for all the GMO foods. And if you just Google, what's his name, if I can remember it. He's a retired federal soil specialist. I can see his picture. I can't remember his name. Anyways, he's spent the first 10 years of his career with the feds promoting GMOs. He spent the middle 10 years saying, oh, the research doesn't look good. And his last 10 years of his 30-year career saying, oh my goodness, GMOs and glyphosate spraying is bad. And he spent his retirement going around the world telling people how bad it actually is. So we spray glyphosate on a lot of cropland all across Canada and the United States. It's actually used as a decanter for wheat products. So if you eat cereal and you're feeding cereal to your kids, you're feeding them glyphosate because it's sprayed on the crop just before it's harvested. So it all ripens at the same time. Then they harvest it all. And the research that they've done looking at whether glyphosate's in cereals or not, our cereals are laden with glyphosate. You got to look for that little blue sticker that says non-GMO if you want to keep GMO out of your kids' diets, because it's causing leaky gut syndrome. And your counterpart in the U.S. is named Zach Bush. Google Zach Bush, and you'll see that Terry Vrain is the guy in Canada. Terrian Vrain, Vrain. So he's a guy you could Google, watch some of his videos. But Matt Bush in the United States has also done a lot of research like this, and he says we have got to get back to growing our own food, because the problems that we're having with processed foods in this world with spraying glyphosate like we are is causing all kinds of health issues in the human population. So if you don't think this issue is going to come home and affect you, think again.
Well, and this is, to me, like unfortunately, for whatever reason, again, in our overall consciousness. And I think that's, I grew up in big cities, in Toronto, in Calgary. I live in St. John here for the last 13 years. When we're in the city, we tend to be disconnected with nature. And I think that's largely where we lose a lot of that consciousness and realizing that we're, where do we get our food? We get it from Sobeys. We get it from, and we forget that the food comes from the land, and we also are part and parcel of the land. And therefore, the way we treat the land is ultimately the way we're treating ourselves. So if we're destroying our land, we're willing to spray all kinds of chemicals into our land. It's very reflective of the way we eat. We eat chemicals, and then people are wondering, why are we so unhealthy? And to me, it was quite evident over the last few years, when the cooties was going around, that's so we don't get flagged. The cooties being, everybody knows, right? The big bad bug that was going around, supposedly was, how freaked out people were, and health. And I thought, great, here's an opportunity finally to wake people up to a higher consciousness of health. And instead of the government officials and leaders using this as an opportunity to inspire people to get back to growing their own food, back to nature, back to the more traditional ways of living, they used it to scare the population and ultimately, line their pockets and basically take power and control. And it was that was why I decided to get into this. I'm like, enough is enough. Like, are you kidding me? Right? Like, here's the perfect opportunity to inspire a largely unhealthy population to look at their health in a new way. And instead of doing that, which in my opinion would have been the responsible thing to do, and what I was hoping that our leaders were going to do, they did the opposite. And I can see how much that they suppress this type of information. It's profits over people. And I think that we really need to get back to, like what you're saying, simple living, back into nature, growing our own food. I've got a project that I've been sharing with you just a little bit called the Canadian Unity Project, where we're looking to essentially start a whole education platform. And one of our pillars within our project is self-sufficient living. That let's get people, and me included in that, growing our own food and being more connected with our community. What do you think it's going to take to wake up New Brunswick? We see it. We have a lot of people here with us. We have 50. I wish we had 5,000. I wish we had 10,000, right? We've got 50. What can us, the 40 of us, the 50 of us, the 60 of us that are connected here, what can we do to educate more people and ultimately start to make the changes so that we head into the right direction?
Well, again, I think there's things happening everywhere. There's this movement is growing, and people are realizing what's going on. The Stop Spraying in Brunswick group is grown phenomenally. The largest petition ever given to the legislature came from them, 30,000 signatures. So people are waking up. You need to share this with other people. I mean, that's obviously what you need to do, like your friends, your neighbors, your family. Just open up conversation. You don't have to have all the answers. Just challenge them to look into it. The other thing with this, if as far as getting the message out, last year in the legislature, we had a legislative committee that looked at glyphosate spraying, and they asked all these experts to come to the legislative assembly and give presentations on glyphosate. So I was there, Stop Spraying New Brunswick was there, the Native peoples were there in the province, the First Nations. There was experts, researchers from University of Moncton. There was researchers from UNB, now out in Western states. Like, there was a lot of experts there. And then at the last minute, guess who shows up? JDI and their entourage. all show up and give their 2 cents worth. But basically, if you look at all those presentations that were given to politicians, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to sit and look and say, all of the experts, all the scientists that know something about what's going on the ground are telling our provincial politicians, wake up, there's problems here. There's lots of issues. We find issues in the soil. We found issues with this stuff staying in the ground for years and years and years. The deer guy says there's a problem with deer. The agriculture people find problems with the ag. Like, there's all kinds of issues. And the only people defending it are the people making big bucks off it. So what happens, what comes out of the legislature is the of course, and again, it shows you how we do not have democracy in our legislatures. And if you think we have democracy, you're dreaming. The only time you have democracy is every 4 years when you get a chance to vote. Because as long as we have a party system, that representative goes to the legislature and they vote what the party tells them to vote for. They don't vote for their constituents. So in my mind, we do not have democracy anymore, which really bothers me. And we see it in New Brunswick because we had the PC party they had a majority on this committee. And basically, there was lots of talk. There was all kinds of good suggestions from the other parties that were there. They ignored it all, and they basically just did another, let's do a little bit more studying, delay, distract, deny. They basically put off glyphosate for another however many 5 years from this glyphosate committee that was supposed to look into everything. They had experts tell them what they should have heard, that it was very problematic, and they ignored it. So this has to be a movement of the people. The people have to wake up, and then they've got to pressure those people, because we had a chance right there for politicians to actually show us what they were made of. And they did. They showed us they weren't made of much, because they denied the facts, they denied the science, and they kept on doing what we've always been doing, putting people's health at risk and putting our environment at risk, as far as I'm concerned. And I was very disappointed in how that ended.
Well, I think many of us saw over time, wherever you land on how the pandemic was handled. One thing that I think we can all agree on, or at least be open to, is how corrupt our systems are actually here in Canada and New Brunswick. And again, I know maybe myself being naive, thinking that corruption happens in other places in the world, not Canada, not here. But I think a lot of people woke up to the corruption and how we don't have a democracy, and we have an illusion of democracy, and we have an illusion that we have a say. But even when we, the people, say we want something to stop, they continue to do it anyways if it's good for certain people's pocketbooks. And you are right. I agree with you that it has to be a grassroots, ground up movement, where we, the people, say enough is enough. And I think there's twofold to that. There's the political way. And that's why I've decided to run with the PPC. And I feel that whether you're a PPC voter or not, doesn't matter. To me, this specific issue is not there, but it's why I decided to get involved politically. But outside the political world, it's also why we started this project called the Canadian Unity Project, because I recognize that it's also a cultural issue. We just have to be more engaged and more educated about what's happening. We cannot just have that mindset of, well, government is going to do it and politicians will take care of it. No, we have to be personally responsible with what is going on in our communities, what's going on in our bodies, what's going on in our environment, in our forests, our water, our air, and making sure that we're protecting this for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. And I'm inspired by what you're doing. I think it's fantastic. It's not easy to go against the grain. It's not easy to go against the big machine, and it is a massive machine. It seems to me like, I know there's the Cumberland files, there's different aspects. You were fired from your job. From a personal perspective, or from, I guess, if you can get us a little insight, what's it been like? Essentially, it seems like you're being silenced as well, or at least there's a I don't want to call it a conspiracy, but seems to be a group of people that don't want you to speak and don't want you. I know you ran with the People's Alliance. There's a group of people that don't want you to be heard. What does that do for you? How do you feel about that? And can you give some words of encouragement, perhaps, to those who feel like, well, nothing can be done. That's just the way it is. They run the show and we're just the little peons that have to go along with it. What would you say to that?
I'm a firm believer in the fact that one person can change the world. Like, one person can change the world. I mean, and we saw that, whatever, 2,000 years ago, one person changed the world a lot. Anyhow, I think I was made for a time like this, just like Churchill was in the Second World War. A lot of people are made for the time that they're in. And, and I'm cracked with the time I'm in, and I'm going to keep, I know what's right. I know what I did right. I know I didn't do anything wrong. And, and I'm going to fight that. I've always in my life, I've always stood up to the bully. And I had friends, and I had cousins, and I had all throughout. And I was never a big guy. I mean, I'm only 6 foot tall, but if somebody was doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, bullying other people, I would stand up for them. I always have my entire life. And I, in a lot of ways, I feel I'm doing that again. And working at Natural Resources, I saw throughout my career, like if we start in around 2009, Bruce Matson was an employee of DNR, wrote a letter as a professional forester to the local paper about JDI. All of a sudden, Bruce Matson, his job's changed. He's out of Hampton. He's moved to Fredericton. And all of us at DNR went, holy mackerel. Obviously, you can't speak out about Irving, or else you get your knuckles rapped. Same thing happened to Doug Mason and his boss, Jean-Paul Robichaud. And then I saw it with Bruce. Everybody saw it very publicly with Bruce Northrup, an MLA. He was the Minister of Natural Resources. He put the kiboshes to Irving. What happens? A letter's written from Irving to the government. All of a sudden, Bruce Northrup is out of cabinet. Like, wake up. And then, of course, what happens? Then in 2050, once they actually get all the wood grab, then the whole habitat section. Somebody should ask, what happened to the habitat section at Fish and Wildlife at DNR? Mike Sullivan sent home with pay. He comes back, and his whole section are all disbanded. The ones that were actually saving the conservation forest for old growth for a suite of species. And then they started making noise saying, hey, we can't do this. We're actually, it's detrimental to the habitat of these critters. They're all disbanded. And then Elise Cleary is fired. No word given. She's given $750,000, and away she goes to muzzled. So, right. They paid her off. And then Marc-Andre Villard, like, the list is long. So I've seen all this in my career. I've watched all this happen. And again, so Rod Cumberland's the next guy. Oh, let's get rid of him. Well, and in all honesty, I think it's backfired, because I think they've realized if they had have actually treated this as professionals and sat down and discussed it and debated it, it probably would have had a whole lot different outcome than just trying to bully your way through and push somebody around that isn't going to be pushed around. And all of a sudden now you're getting all kinds of flack. There's lots of meat. And in a lot of ways, this has actually benefited the whole issue, because people are more and more people are finding out why is Rod Cumberland going to court? He's been 3 years. And what's it all about? And it keeps coming up, and they say, well, I don't know. They fired him for changing the clock, making kids show up on time, and taking their ball caps off. And people go, that ain't what's that? You can't fire a guy for that stuff. And it's very clear. The fourth thing on the list is glyphosate spraying, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on.
Well, you know what, and I think, like you said, I think that they finally have met some people who stand for principles. Who won't just back down to bullying or to being pushed around, but we'll stand up, we'll speak out, we'll organize, we'll get better, and we're only going to continue to grow from here. The voice of the people is actually growing, and I think that you're going to see. Look, every dynasty and every major empire has its downfalls, and I think that's what you're going to see. And it's not that for me, it's not about like anti-Irving or anti-big anything. It's not about anti, it's about pro. Right. It's about pro-life. It's about meaning pro-life in the context of like, let's make sure that we're living in harmony with nature. Let's make sure we're honoring some of those traditional values that seem to be lost. Let's get back to family values. Let's get back to nature. And it just seems like, again, it's not just a political issue, but it's a cultural issue. But I think here in New Brunswick, it's funny. They say sometimes the biggest things happen in the smallest places, meaning I think here in New Brunswick, we have the real opportunity to take a stand, to really create real change from the grassroots up on all levels, education, health, and definitely in our politics. And with that, we can inspire the rest of the country, and like you said, the rest of the world, and we can really have a massive ripple effect. So I encourage anyone out there that's listening right now, first of all, please, if you can, support Rod. I saw this, Jerry. Thank you so much for posting this. So you could send an e-transfer to friends of Rod Cumberland at gmail.com, or you could send a check payable to Friends of Rod Cumberland, 383 Route 616, Keswick Ridge, New Brunswick. I'll leave that up for a little bit so you can jot that down and see it. And that way you could support their legal fight, and you could support what it is that they're doing. Rod, you want to give a little bit of insight if somebody makes a donation, or what exactly they're donating to and how that's helping you?
Yeah, and I'd like to be clear about that, because some people may think, actually, they attacked me because I'm not a rich guy. Okay, right. I raised 4 kids on a farm in Keswick Ridge. I milked a cow for 12 years. I mean, I'm not rolling in the dough. So I think the thought was, because I had nothing, he'll go away. We'll offer to settle with him, and he'll take the money and run. But again, like, I'm a man of principle, and I've been wronged. My name has been tarnished, and they've said things about me that are definitely not true. And I'm going to see it through to the end. I want the truth out so that people know what really did happen at the college. Was Rod Cumberland a really bad instructor? Was he really terrible with his students? And when the truth comes out, everybody will know. And the other thing is, I'm doing this because there's no one ever goes a distance in New Brunswick. And because of that, there's, if you look at our court cases and stuff, everybody always settles before they get to court, because there's no chance of you ever recouping your money when I think they pay you. We all have this assumption, if you win at court, the bad guys pay the good guys all their legal fees. In New Brunswick, it doesn't work that way. Rule 59, I think 10% is what they'll cover of my legal fees. So even if I win, hypothetically, you get whatever the settlement is, taxes come off the top of that. Then you pay your legal fees, and then hopefully you can pay the debt you've accrued over the last, for me, it's been 3 years. So, Rod Cumberland's not doing this to get rich, because it's not going to happen. It's impossible. So, and in actual fact, to this point in time, all my legal fees have been paid for by friends. And Jerry Redmond, my previous boss, I can't thank him and his team enough for all what they've done to raise funds for us, because it has paid the bill to this point in time. And thankfully, I'm glad he's done it, because if he hadn't done it, I'd have been that much in the hole. So again, this isn't a money-making venture for Rod Cumberland. This is someone who has a good case that can make a point and actually improve things for those that follow. So the next person that gets railroaded by this same process, trying to speak the truth and having freedom of speech being taken away, if we set precedents here with this, it'll help the people that come after. And that's the goal. And also to make that college, a better place for the students, and try to recoup what we've lost over the last few years. So that's what it's about. It's obviously it started out about me and what happened, but then when I'm lied about, and there's a lot of misinformation put in the papers, and the papers that are owned by certain people, and by their lawyers the same day, that tells you something. Like there's something going on here that's not different from what's happened to Tyrone Hayes, to Marc-Andre Villard, all the people that have spoken out, that have taken a knock in the knuckles. That's what happens, And then the other thing that they do, they get involved in the research. And I don't know how much time we have, but I could tell you about how companies have gotten involved in research across this country, whether it's moose research in BC, whatever it is, they've gotten involved to control the outcome of the research. And that really bothers me. That's not right.
Yeah. We see that in all aspects of society now, where they'll be like, well, there's this research paper shows this, and you can see that. I'm like, well, yeah, if the same guy cutting the check is also vested in a certain outcome, right? That research is always skewed. That's why independent research, just like independent media, it's why I'm a big fan of separating government from media. Why? Because independent media, independent research, allowing different conversations to happen, different schools of thoughts to come together, actually gives us more accurate information. But we have a situation right now where government, corporations, media are all one. And therefore, they're controlling the narrative and they're controlling the quote unquote research and the science, in which some of our politicians love to use the word science, science, science. Yet, when scientists present them with information that doesn't go along with their supposed science, then it gets squashed, it gets silenced. And if they can't silence you, they do the next thing, which is slander you. Then they try to discredit you in any way they can. And that's, of course, it becomes a political battle and war. So listen, I want to just thank you so much for spending some time here with us. Diving deeper into this issue. This is something we're going to be talking about. At least I'm going to be talking about more and more. I know, Rod, you're going to continue to fight the good fight. Please, once again, you guys can make a donation to Rod Cumberland. I'll put the information back up so you have another opportunity. Please help out with what you can. It's important that you support the people who are on the front lines, who are battling it out, because these are the folks that are going to make a change, that are going to make a difference in our cities, in our provinces, and ultimately in our nation. And you don't need me to tell you, it is badly needed right now. So, Rod, thank you again for your time, and just appreciate you spending so much time with us.
My pleasure, Nick. Great getting to know you. Thanks.
Thanks.
Become a member of the Canadian Unity Project by visiting the links in the description.